Hello and welcome to Non-Inkables. This is the long promised video about deck building. I am definitely not a pro deck builder, but I have been trying to get better at it because I am jealous of all those people who can make their own decks that kind of go against the meta and work really well, and I just want to be one of them. So this video, as always, is based on an article that I found on TCG Player called Deck Building 101: How to Build Decks for the Disney Lorcana card game. I think that article is pretty old, so I've tried to update it to be more current. I have two decks here for no reason, just because they match the background color of the little PowerPointy thing I made. And so let's get started. All right, so we will talk about in this lecture of whatever, in this lesson about basic requirements of a deck, your ink curve, the meta, number of cards, how many uninkables do you have, other ways to build, testing, and then hot takes, and then how to adapt your deck. So I think a good way to practice or think about deck building is actually to play in limited formats. So that refers to draft and to sealed, currently like the two limited formats that exist in Lorcana. And so in sealed, you get 6 packs of cards, usually from one set, and then you make a deck of 40 cards and you play with that. And in draft, it's similar, except that you pick a card from the pack that you open and you pass it to the person next to you. So you have to judge based on the 12 cards that you have, which one is the best that you want. I think both are fun. I like sealed better because I like that the cards I open are my cards. Because I think in draft, the issue comes up where you're like, okay, do I keep this card because it's worth a lot of money? Because it's a legendary, even if it's like not playable, or do I take this better card that is like a common and is good for my deck, so I might win more, but like it has no resale value, right? So I think that decision is sometimes hard. And when you play a limited format, because it's usually just one set, you're missing a lot of pieces that you would normally have in a constructed deck. So if you think about like the classic Ruby Amethyst deck, you have draw from Merlin Rabbit and Friends on the Other Side. You have your removal from Ruby with things like Be Prepared and Medusa and Lady Tremaine. But if you're playing a set like set 5, you might not have that kind of direct removal. So usually the things most people are missing when they play those limited formats is draw. So you end up having no cards, and or direct removal. So you have to challenge. So a lot of limited games end up being kind of like a stalemate type situation where neither person wants to quest because the other person can then make favorable trades. So you're just putting characters out on the board until someone like puts something that that has to get dealt with. And so somebody has to make a move. In limited, you'll also tend to value cards that have evasive because there's not that much direct removal. So if they don't have anything to deal with evasive, then your evasives kind of get a quest for free. And then also because there's no direct removal, bodyguard becomes really important. And then also cards that 2 for 1. So it's a card that one card can take out 2 cards. So an example of a card that could 2 for 1 would be something like maybe Maui, because he's a 6/5, right? So you can probably take out 2 characters before getting banished. Okay, so that's a good way to practice and like kind of get your gears going about how to think about deck building, and to really highlight what things are important in a deck and what you need. So the basics of a Lorcana deck, you have to have at least 60 cards. So the minimum number of cards is 60. Some people will argue that that is also the maximum. We'll talk about that later. You can have up to 2 ink colors. So technically you could have a monocolored deck. However, most of the ink colors have their own little personality to it. And so like I would say ruby and steel are very like attacky, and then amber and sapphire are more support. And so it's good to pair one of those, one a support color with an attack color, and then amethyst and emerald are kind of like their own weird thing. But usually if you're doing 2 colors, there will be a card in one color that is better than a similar card in the other color. So you'll get best of both worlds. So if you try to make a deck with one color, you're really just limiting yourself. And for each card, you can have up to 4 copies. So that isn't to say like you can only have 4 copies of one character. So for example, you could have 4 copies of Ariel without legs, and then you can have 4 copies of Ariel Spectacular Singer, right? So even though they're both Ariels, it's a different card. And the other thing to think about why you want 60 cards is just because of probability. So the probability that you'll get the card that you want for the specific situation you're in is greater if you're drawing from a pool that's less, right? So if I say like I need to be prepared or else the game is over for me. If I have 60 cards in my deck, I'm much more likely to get that be prepared than if I have like 80 cards in my deck, right? So it's just math. An exception to this is if you're playing a mill deck, so your goal is to have your opponent run out of cards, and most people run 60 cards. So if you run more than 60 cards, you could potentially get your opponents to run out of cards while you still have cards. That's kind of more rare, and I feel like most of the mill decks I've seen haven't worked. And let's see. Another thing about the ink colors is you just want 2 colors that synergize together. So I actually have a video that kind of talks more about the different ink colors and their personalities. If you want to check that out, I related to Hogwarts houses because I feel like that is how I think about things. So other things to think about are like, one is what is your play style? And I think this is kind of hard to know because I was asked this question like early set 4 and I was still like, I don't know my play style. I like to play to win, which is that's not a play style. But like, do you like to control? So do you want to have answers for everything your opponent does? Like, would you prefer to play a longer game where there's like more back and forth and you have a lot of interaction? Then you probably want to play something with like red, ruby, or steel. Another play style is like, I just want to put cards down and quest and win as fast as possible. And so that would be like hyper aggro. So you want short games. So kind of like, it's hard to know what your play style is until you play. So you just have to kind of test out different decks. And like, I really like how Amber Steel works, but that deck hates me. And every time I either get only singers or only songs. And every time I play an Ariel, I never get a song. And so even though I like the idea of that deck, I know that for me, like for some reason, it just doesn't click. The other thing that you need to think about when you're making your deck is, what is my win condition? So like, how am I going to win? Sometimes people will call this like your win con for short. Sometimes people will say like, what is the thesis of your deck? Which sounds very like PhD, but it's basically like how does your deck win? So for like, say right now, Ruby Sapphire is really popular, and that deck usually wins with Tamatoa Lucky Dime, right? So you play the Lucky Dime, you play the Tamatoa, you have a bunch of items, you tap the Lucky Dime, you get like 7, 8 lore, and you win. Like Yellow Purple, that's aggressive. You just put down characters, you turn them sideways, they quest. At some point, you slap down a bodyguard so that they can't touch your very weak questers, and you just quest and you win, right? And so that you have to figure out like, how is your deck going to win? Like red purple, what it does is it controls the other deck. So it basically like anything the opponent plays, it gets rid of, and then it just quests with the stuff that it has on board, and that's how it wins. Sometimes people will also call this like the archetype of the deck, like if it's hyper aggro, if it's mid-range control. And if you check out, I think it's in my TCG Terms 1 video, we go over all of these terms because it gets kind of confusing. And so the things to think about is like, the reason why you need to think about how your deck is going to win, or like what the thesis of your deck is if you try to do too many things in your deck, it actually makes your deck weaker. And so the goal is to have a deck where the cards are flexible in the way that you play them. So like the cards can be used in multiple ways for different scenarios, right? So your ideal is that every card in your deck can work in almost every scenario, and you can just adjust how you play them to adjust for that. The less ideal would be to have like a bunch of cards that are like, okay, I need this card if this situation happens. I need this card if this situation happens, because the probability of you getting the correct card for the correct situation is low. And then if you get a card that's like totally useless for the current situation you're in that's for another situation, then like that card is useless. And so your deck is like weaker because of that, right? And so the other thing to think about are what are the synergies in my deck, right? So if you guys watch my podcast, you know that I played an item, pretty much item only or very item heavy deck for the DLC in Vegas. So that deck essentially has a synergy between Maurice's Workshop and the Queen, right? And items, because the item deck. So Maurice's Workshop has the ability, when you play an item, you pay one more ink, you draw a card, right? So there is your draw engine, essentially. That's how you draw cards. The Queen lets you look for the top 4 cards in your deck. If one's an item, you can take it into your hand. If it costs 3 or less, you can play it for free. So then essentially, let's say you have a Maurice's Workshop on board. You do the Queen's ability, you get like a fishbone quill. You get to play it for free because it costs 3. And then you can pay one more ink to draw cards. You're essentially just paying an ink to draw a card. That is like a synergy you can have. Another option would be like the green steel deck that won. So it plays Prince John. So Prince John has the ability that when your opponent discards a card, you draw a card, right? So you're gaining advantage. And then that deck plays a bunch of cards that make your opponents discard cards. So like Hypnotize or Sudden Chill. And that is how they draw cards. And really drawing cards is a very good advantage to have in Lorcana. And then the other synergies that are common are like red purple. They play that Flynn Sisu package. So Flynn on 2 and then Sisu on 3. And the Sisu has strength equal to the number of cards in your opponent's hand plus 1. And then Flynn, if you have the strongest character on board, you get 3 lore automatically, right? The thing when you think about these synergies is you don't want to get greedy and then make a deck that requires a lot of different pieces for the synergies to work, because then your deck is not going to work the way you want it to. Because like I feel like this is a thing that in the beginning I was like, oh, I can do this and do this and do this and then all these things, and then like you play it and you're like, oh, I don't get all those cards in my hand together. So when it needs like multiple pieces, then it makes it very hard. It's much easier if, say, your whole deck does kind of like has the same synergy. So for example, like if you're playing a amber steel song deck and you are singing a lot of songs, it would be reasonable to have like a flute where every time you sing a song, you gain a lore. So like the likelihood of you singing a song is pretty high because your deck is like based on songs. And then if you have a flute out, you just get a lore, right? So things to think about. Next, we move on to ink curve. So this is the ideal way of like, what order do I want to play my cards in? So like turn 1, what do I want to play? Turn 2, what do I want to play? Turn 3, what do I want to play? And it's good to have like a nice curve across all of the inks. I feel like most decks tend to be like a bell curve because once you get to more ink, maybe you could play 2 cards a turn. And then the other thing to think about is like, what is my most expensive card? So what ink do I have to at least get to? So say, for example, I'm running this Enchanted Elsa because I'm a baller and I'm going to put enchanted cards in my deck. And so then if I'm playing that deck, I want to get at least 8 ink, right? So if I ever get Enchanted Elsa, I want to be able to play her. But sometimes you might want to ink further than your most expensive card. So like early set 4, I played against Ed, the winner of Dallas, Texas, and he was playing red purple, and he got up to like 13, 14, 15 ink. And that let him do things like play triple castle. It lets him play like goat, bounce, goat, bounce, goat. So you could do like multiple things in one turn. And that is something like the Sapphire ramp decks really take advantage of. So they play their Tipo, they play their one jump ahead, they fishbone quill, and then they ramp, and then all of a sudden they have like a ton of ramp. And I remember in like at least set 3, the goal was to get to like, I think 14 ink, because then you could play Bell and Dime and then use Dime on Bell in the same turn. That way, if Bell dies or gets banished from Medusa or whatever, you still got like the lore from Bella at least one time. And then the other thing to think about is just how many inkable cards do you want versus uninkable cards? Most decks tend to stay around 15 to 18. And if you play something like Fishbone Quill, which lets you ink uninkable cards, or you play something like Tipo, which also lets you ink uninkable cards, or if you play Hidden Inkcaster in green, which I haven't seen anyone play, but it also lets you ink uninkable cards. So then you won't get stuck with a hand of all uninkables and be unable to play anything. And then one thing that I think that you should think about when you're thinking about inkable versus non-inkable cards, oops, I went too far, is if the cards are truly inkable. So for example, I only know of this because I was listening to a podcast with Ed from the winner of Fort Worth, and he was talking about, because he's playing Red Purple, right? So Red Purple has that bounce package of Madam M Snake, Madam M Fox, Merlin Goat, Merlin Rabbit. And even though cards like Goat, Fox, and Snake are inkable, you want to use them, right? So like the thesis of that deck, a lot of it is through bounce and getting lore in other ways and utilizing that bounce package. And so even though those cards are inkable, you don't actually want to ink them. So you want to think of them as almost like uninkable cards because you want to keep them, you want to be able to use all 4 copies. Another example of this would be like Ariel, Spectacular Singer in Amber Steel. She's technically inkable, but I don't think I very rarely have seen anybody ink her because she's so valuable. Another card would be Popsicle in a Sapphire Ruby deck or a Sapphire Steel deck. And so that's kind of like another higher level of thinking when you think about your inkable cards. Another higher level of thinking when you think about your inkable cards. Okay, and then another thing to consider is where are you taking your deck? And what kind of players are you going to go against? So are you taking your deck to something big like Disney Lorcana Challenge, where there's 2,000 people who come from lots of different places and are going to be bringing probably meta decks, right? So like the most popular decks. So for example, this past Las Vegas one, the most popular decks were Ruby Sapphire, Amber Steel, and Red Purple. Or are you taking your deck to set championships? So a little bit more local. I think I've seen in local tournaments, there tends to be more hyper aggro and a lot more like homebrewy decks. So like not meta decks. Are you taking your deck to league? So are you required to have like a theme for your deck? I think one of our local people is hosting like a movie challenge. So all your cards have to come from the same movie franchise. And so then that changes your whole deck building thing, right? Are you just playing for fun against your friends? Maybe you're going to like Enchanted Kim's Pacific Northwest Princess Lorcana party, which I'm so jealous that I didn't get to go to. They had like tea with like sandwiches and drinks and played Lorcana and wore like tiaras, and I would totally wish I could have gone and like worn a ball gown, the whole thing, right? So that's like a very different setting. Also, one thing to think about is, are you playing against one person or are you playing multiplayer? Because multiplayer changes your decisions a lot. So there are cards that when you start to play multiplayer are way more valuable. So there are cards that say like, when you do this, each opponent, blah, blah, blah. So like, for example, Sudden Chill. When you play this card, each opponent chooses and discards a card, right? So say you're playing against 4 people and you play Sudden Chill. They each discard a card. You get 4 cards if you have a Prince John. Or let's say First Chapter Ursula. When you play this card, each opponent loses a lore. You draw a card for every lore lost. I think that's what it is. So and then like Lady Tremaine would be really good in multiplayer because each opponent chooses and discards a character, banishes a character. So you have to think about what are you doing with this deck? Where are you going? And I think that changes what you play. And then like, for example, if you know your local meta, you can base your deck based on that. Like I played this guy in France and he said that everyone around him plays red purple. Like there's 24 people at his local game store, 20 of them play red purple. In which case, if I was going to a set championships, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to play like the anti-red purple deck, like Amber Steel, which is what he is doing. So yeah, that's one thing to think about. Okay, so now down into the more nitty-gritty things. Nitty-gritty things of how many copies of each card do you want, right? So you figured out like kind of what your thesis is, and you're trying to figure out like, do I want 4 copies of each? What do I want to do? So in terms of inkable cards, the cards you have 4 copies of are cards that you always want to see, and you always want multiple copies of this card. So examples would be like Cinderella Singer in a song deck, Ariel Spectacular Singer. You always want to see those 2 cards. And then like say red, purple, you always want 4 foxes, 4 snakes, 4 goats, 4 rabbits. That's like their core, right? In any ramp deck, you always want 4 popsicles. If you're playing blue steel, you want 4 fortispheres. Let's see, if you're playing green steel, you probably want 4 Diablos because that card is insane. So it's cards that you always want, and you want multiples of them. 3 copies would be a card that you always want, but you would prefer like not to have 2 of them in your hand. 2 copies would be like more of a tech card. So you want to see it in certain games, but they might not be always good. And then 1 copy is cards that are you like maybe want to see once in a while. Some would argue that you shouldn't have any 1 copies in your deck. And others would say like, oh, this would be like your silver bullet in like a meta deck. So like, for example, if someone was playing like our deck items, a silver bullet they would want to include is maybe like, I find them, I flatten them, it gets rid of all items. But like, it's only good for our deck, so you don't want to put multiple copies in it because you're wasting space. They could be playing something better. And then the other thing you want to think about is like, yes, the maximum is 4 copies of a card, right? But really, because you're using 2 ink colors, there are often like 2 cards that do almost the same thing. So for example, blue steel, you have Popsicle, draws a card when you play it. Fortisphere also draws a card when you play it. Obviously, when you banish Popsicle, you heal. When you banish Fortisphere, you give Bodyguard, whatever. But most of the time, people are using those 2 cards to draw cards. And so it's kind of like having 8 Popsicles or 8 Fortispheres. There's also like a bunch of 2-cost characters that are 2/2 in Quest for 2. So like, I think Amethyst has that magical maid who is not a broom. She's a feather duster, but I always think of her as a broom. And there's like a steel version. I think Arthur is a steel version. And there's like just a version of that in every single color. A commonly seen combo is like, I think there's set 3 red purple. They would play Minnie Mouse, always classy. She's 1/3, quest for 1, cost 1. And Olaf, 1/3, quest for 1, cost 1. So it's basically like 8 of the same card, even though it's just in 2 different colors. So that is also something to think about. And then what about non-inkables or uninkable cards? So this is where things often get cut. This is often where you don't have 4 ofs. So if you have a 4 of an uninkable card, it means it's a card that you always need. Like you need this card. So examples of this would be like Lilo and Maleficent, the 1-cost 1/1 that quests for 2 in a hyper aggro deck. Like you always want to see this on 1. And if you have like a bunch of them, you just play a bunch of them and quest and hope your opponent can't do anything. Another example would be like Merlin Rabbit in a Amethyst deck because you want that ability to draw. Another example would be like A Whole New World in a song deck. And then, so it's a card that you just like need. You need to see it every single game. A 3 of is a card that you definitely want, but you don't necessarily want 2 of them in your hand at the same time. Sometimes this is maybe a be prepared, although controversial. Some people play 4, some people play 2. And sometimes it's like a really good card. And if it were inkable, you would play 4 of, but because it's uninkable, you play 3 just to be on the safe side. 2 of is something that you want in your deck, but if you draw 2, that might lose you the game. So something I think about is like Lucky Dime. There's usually only 2 in a ramp deck because it's 7-cost uninkable card, and it's a card you definitely need, but you don't want it in your opening hand because it'll get stuck there, or you have to Fishbone Quill it and hope you draw the other one because that is part of your win condition. And then 1 of is usually a tech card for a specific matchup. So I think the most common 1 of that I see currently is probably a Lady Tremaine, and that is geared towards like Tamatoa mostly, because there's, besides Lady Tremaine, the main way that a deck could get rid of Tamatoa, like a deck that's playing red, is to use Be Prepared. And so it just gives another option to get rid of that 1 card because Tamatoa's a little too big for Medusa to take care of. Definitely can't brawl him. Yeah. So those are your uninkable cards. And I would say most decks probably play around 16 uninkable cards. And it kind of also depends on your luck. So like our channel, non-inkables, is called that because I always draw non-inkables. I think at one time I was playing a deck that only had 12 non-inkables, and I saw like maybe 10 of them in like the first couple turns. That's also happened to Brian. He was playing this last set champs, a deck that had, I want to say 8 uninkables, and in his he mulliganed super hard because he's like, I only have 8 uninkables, I'll be fine. He got 6 of them in his opening hand. So yeah. So when you include uninkable cards in your deck, you have to think really hard. Like, do I really need this card? Is this card so good that I would take the chance of it getting stuck in my hand and I can't ink it? You know, like, is it worth it, essentially? And then the other thing is like the ratio of different cards in your deck. So most decks play like probably 2/3 characters and then 1/3 like other stuff. So like items, location, songs. If you're playing a Mufasa deck, so you have the Amber Mufasa that like when he is banished, you can look at the top card of your deck. If it's a character, you play it for free, exerted, right? So in those decks, all characters 100% because you want that Mufasa to hit. And there are versions of that deck where they don't play 100% characters, and then sometimes that Mufasa gets banished and they get like a lantern or like something else, and then it's just like, that sucks. Your Mufasa is banished and you didn't get it really use his ability. Obviously, if you're playing a song deck, you have more songs. If you're playing an item deck, you have more items. So it changes your ratio a little bit. But in general, probably 2/3 characters. All right, so other ways to build around, like build a deck. Like, how do you even come up with an idea of what to do? So one example that I like to use is like Bucky, right? So Bucky pre-errata was 2 cost with ward. And when you play a floodborn character, your opponent discards a card. So they built Emerald Steel around Bucky by playing Bucky on 2, and then they would just start playing all these floodborn characters so your opponent had no hands, right? There are some decks I've seen that's built around like, so that's an example of like building around one card. I've seen a deck that's built around like a weight set deck. We have a local who sometimes plays that. So I've played against that. So weight set is an item that lets you draw a card for 1 ink every time you play a character that is 4 strength or more. So that is the way you draw cards in that deck. And so that deck plays a bunch of characters that are all 4 strength or more. And that's, you could build a card around or deck around that card. I did also play against in set championships, I think in set 3, against a deck that was built around the mechanic of like discard of Sheriff of Nottingham in steel. So when you discard a card, you may deal 1 damage to chosen opposing character. And so that deck played like the Cinderella, like the little Cinderella Knight, where when you play her, you get to draw a card and discard a card, right? So because you discard a card, you deal a damage because you have Sheriff of Nottingham. It played the Simba, that's like a 1/2 that also does that. It played the little Tinkerbell, where each turn you can exert to draw a card, discard a card. It played the Bayou, where every time you quest, you can draw a card, discard a card. So it just worked on that synergy. And so everything in the deck would just draw a card, discard a card as an ability. And then if you have Sheriff of Nottingham out, you can just bloop, 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 deal a bunch of damage, right? And then I think that would probably pair well with things in Emerald. So I think the deck I played was actually a Ruby Steel deck, but I think if they'd made it like Emerald Steel, because Emerald has a lot of stuff, especially now, where if you have a damaged character, like this can happen. Like if you have Helga Sinclair, you can like banish damaged character, I think, or like deal more damage, you know, things like that. So I think that would pair very well. I tried to make a trolley deck that was based around all the characters where when you play them, your opponent loses a lore plus Shere Khan. So whenever your character challenges another character, you get 1 lore. And so it was like the goal was to like play Aladdin and then shift him to Aladdin Heroic Outlaw. So then when you challenge a character, your opponent loses 2 lore, you gain 2 lore, and then you gain another lore because you have Shere Khan. So in really the net gain is 5 because you've gained 3 lore and your opponent has lost 2 lore. I couldn't really figure out, like, that deck was pretty okay, but like not great into like meta decks. So that was more like a for fun deck, trolley deck. And I feel like that deck would be probably a little bit better in maybe like a multiplayer format. And then the other thing to think about is like just Floodborn character interactions, right? So Bucky is like the one that everybody knows for Emerald, but there actually is a character in every single ink color that does something when you play a Floodborn character. So in Amber, you have Nana. She's like the dog from Peter Pan. So when you play a Floodborn character, you can remove all the damage from chosen character. So you could combine that with like one of the cards where it's like when you remove damage, blah, 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 you can do this. There's the blue fairy, which I think is used pretty like a maybe second to Bucky. So she's an amethyst and she's like a 2-cost 1/1 evasive. But when you play a Floodborn character, you can draw a card. There is Honest John, who I've seen nobody use. He's like a 3-cost uninkable, probably why nobody uses him because he's uninkable. In Ruby, that when you play a Floodborn character, your opponent loses the lore. Sapphire has Mrs. Judson. When you play a Floodborn character, put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down and exerted. So it's like a constant ramp. And then Steel Chief Bogo, we've talked about, deal 1 damage to each opposing character whenever you play a Floodborn character. Oh no, actually, we talked about Sheriff of Nottingham, which is when you discard a card, you may deal 1 damage. So Steel has Chief Bogo. When you play a Floodborn character, you can deal 1 damage to opposing character. So those are things to think about. Okay, so let's say you've made your deck, it's 60 cards, blah, 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 all that stuff. Then what? Then you have to test the deck. So it's recommended that you test for at least 10 games, but obviously the more you test, the better, because you want a bigger sample size and you want more data. More data is better. And then when you test, usually most people would do what's called running the gauntlet. So you test it against the current meta decks. So for now, it would be like testing against Ruby Sapphire, Amber Steel, Red Purple, and Green Steel. Those are like the hot decks. So the decks you're most likely going to see. So you want to make sure that your deck is good into those decks. And different ways of testing. The first picture is of Inktable. So that is an AI. Benefits of that, you can play it on your phone, you can play it on your computer at any time. You don't need to find an opponent. The AI is not super smart, but sometimes it surprises me and it does like some cool combos. The second one is you can practice in real life. That's picture me from set 3 championships. You can also practice via webcam real life, with other people. So the most common platform is on Pixelborn Connect. And then the last one is you can use Tabletop Simulator. So this is like a program I use it on Steam. I think it's only in Steam. I'm not sure how games work, but you can basically load your deck into there and play someone. Some people will use this when they play on Pixelborn Connect. So they'll use that as like their virtual camera, but you can play against other people. And so you need to test. The other thing to think about when testing is, besides like just running your deck, you have to also think about like maybe different ways of playing your deck, right? So ideally your deck is super flexible, and so your cards can be utilized in, I guess, different and alternative and interesting ways. So that's something to think about. So for example, in our item deck, we play an item called Shield of Virtue. So it's a 1-cost item. You can pay 3 ink and it will ready a character, and that character cannot quest, right? So most common use for that card is that we will use it to ready the queen so she can do her queen ability again. However, you could also potentially use it, and Brian and I found this out from watching one of White Warlock's videos from last set when he talked about red-blue items. You could use it to ready your opponent's Diablo so that their Diablo is not exerted, so you can draw all the cards you want and they don't get any cards, which is probably infuriating for them. So you have to kind of think about different ways, I suppose, to utilize the cards that you have in your deck. And sometimes you get like very cool combo-y things from this. And so sometimes you need other people to help test your deck because they might come up with like a better, different way to play it, right? So for example, like our deck, the first time I played it, I was like, this deck is horrible. I hate it. It sucks. Can't draw any cards. I just have all uninkables in my hand. I hate this deck. And it's because I wasn't playing it correctly. And so sometimes that happens. and you have to figure out like the correct way to, like, you have to think about like what are you mulliganing for, and then what your ideal play curve is and all that stuff. So the more testing you can do, the better. And also it lets you know how to play against certain colors. Yeah. Okay, so next we're going to talk about hot takes. Hot takes. So hot takes. Number 1, 60 cards only. So this is, I think, often talked about in a lot of the Lorcana podcasts that we listen to. So because 60 is the minimum amount of cards, most, I would say, seasoned card players say that you should only have 60 cards in your deck. And if you have more than 60, they will make fun of you and mock you, because having the minimum amount of cards basically increases the statistical probability of drawing the card that you need when you need it. And when you have more cards, you are diluting that statistical probability. Also, people will say that if you can't cut it down to 60, like, you haven't tested enough. You need to test so you know what the cards are the best cards, and you just cut the ones that are not as good. There are also people who say you shouldn't have any one-of cards, because if you only have one of them, it's not a very good card. And then the same thing for some people say that you need to have 4 copies of every card. And that is how you stay the most consistent. So consistency basically means like every time you draw a card, like, I like to think of it, I think the easiest way for me to think of it is like, if your opponent plays Whole New World and you have to discard 7 cards, when you draw 7 new cards, if you are playing a very consistent deck, the likelihood that you have like a lot of the same cards is high, right? So that's a very consistent deck. And I think Ruby Amethyst is probably the poster child for being the most consistent deck, partly because they can draw a lot of cards. So they always can find what they need just by drawing a bunch of cards, and also because they play a lot of 4-ofs. And if you look at different deck builders, there are some deck builders who only play 4 of every card. And then there's some deck builders who will like split it like 2 and 2, or they'll do like 1 and 3. So like, for example, Ruby Amethyst, the split of, they call them the chair ladies. So it's Lady Tremaine and Madame Medusa because they're both sitting. Some people do 4 Medusas. Some people will do like 1 Tremaine, 3 Medusas. Some people, now because of the addition of Big Sisu, sometimes it's only 2 Medusas. So that changes a little bit, but usually like 4 copies of every card. And those decks, I feel like when I see them, the deck list, I'm just like, ooh, so nice. There's like not a lot of cards, and then it's just like 4 of everything. It's so simple and predictable. And yeah. And then another hot take is that there are people who say you shouldn't have any uninkable tech cards. So tech cards are like cards that you put usually 1 of or maybe 2 of for a specific matchup. And because it's like only very useful in that one specific matchup, then it should be inkable. In case you're not playing that matchup, you should be able to use it as ink, and it'd be like ink immediately because it's not good for this matchup. But if it's uninkable, then it just gets stuck in your hand, and it's not even good for the matchup you're playing probably, and you can't even ink it, and so then it's just a dead card. You shouldn't have that kind of, I would say, trash in your deck. So those are like the hot takes. And then you have to consider the meta and adapt to it. So, for example, a lot of the ramp decks were playing, I would say last set, right? Sapphire, Ruby Sapphire, or Sapphire Steel. They were playing a lot of How Far I'll Go and One Jump Ahead. And then Green Steel came and started playing that 2-drop Ursula and ripping the 1 jump ahead out of people's hands. And so then they kind of adapted and started playing more Mickey Mouse Detective. So he lets you do the same thing as 1 jump ahead, but he's a character so they can't rip it out of your hand, right? In this set, they'll play like Tipo and Donald. And then last set, the Flynn Sisu from Ruby Amethyst was rampant. And so a lot of the steel decks started teching in Argus, who is like a 2-cost 4/1, just to prevent Flynn from getting that additional lore. And then, of course, everyone last set had to adapt to Diablo. So they had to play something that would get rid of Diablos, whether it be a Brawl or a Let the Storm Rage On or something else, right? And so as people change their deck, you have to, and the way to like know is kind of like look at deck lists from like competitions that are happening on ink decks, or like there's a lot of streamers who will talk about the meta. So like Forbidden Mountain does it, Goons I think sometimes does it, Spessy. A lot of them will talk about how the meta is changing and they will adjust their decks, and you can kind of like follow that. And then sometimes it's just good to look to see if there is a character that has the same ability as the action you want to play. So for example, in Sapphire, there's a card, Let It Go, which takes your opponent's character and puts them in the inkwell, right? There is also a card called Hades that does the same thing, but you leave a body on board. And so it's good to see if there is a character that'll do the same thing that you want to do as an action. If there's a lot of cards in the meta that prevent you from doing actions, like Pete, the referee, that new card that is like wrecking, I feel like wrecking some Amber Steel and some Ruby decks. And so you just have to adapt and figure out what to play, I guess. And so, for example, like our deck, we're adapting it for Seattle to account for green steel, because we didn't really consider that very much going into Vegas, because it wasn't like a thing until like literally the day before. And then when all else fails, you can play a starter deck and then just try to like adjust it, take out the cards you don't like and put in new cards. Or you can use someone else's deck, which is apparently called net decking, because you're finding the deck on the net. So you could look at, I feel like most people look at either ink decks for like the top tournament decks, or they will look on Dreamborn, or they'll watch YouTube videos of creators who make decks and test them out. And so that is one way to figure out what deck to play. You could just take their deck and then maybe adjust it a little bit to your play style and then play it. So like that's what I did for set 3. I took Spessy's Emerald Steel deck and I teched in a Cusco for funsies because I like Cusco and he has Ward. And he did actually win me a game. That's just luck though. I don't think that was a good decision. I did not understand deck building at all at that time. And I would have totally run a more than 60 card deck. So yeah, and then this set 4, I played Ruby Amethyst, and I took Kendall's list because he is like the Ruby Amethyst grandfather person. Also, he wrote the guide. Oh, that's the other thing. A lot of decks now, if you go on Discord, on the 20 lore Discord, I think usually you have to like comb through some of the chats because they have like different chats for each deck color. A lot of people are making like deck guides basically on how to play the deck. So for example, red purple, there is a guide from Kendall. He made one I think for last set, and I think there's a new one for this set. It's like probably $5, and it basically goes through like, this is what you want to mulligan for, this is how you play a matchup against Amber Steel, this is how you play against Ruby Sapphire, blah 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 blah, right? There was also a free one last set by El Rathion for red purple, so if you like search through the Discord you can find a link. I know that for red blue, Sailor, the person who made the Sisu on Ice deck, has a guide out if you join, I think, his Patreon. I did also find one for Amber Emerald when I was like briefly considering that as my deck. And so that's also another way to learn how to play different decks. And then of course, YouTube. So like this red blue item deck that we're playing, Brian and I watched a lot of White Warlock because he did a pretty extensive deck guide on it in set 3. And although a lot of the cards have changed, we don't play the same cards, but a lot of the ideas are still very relevant, right? And then also you can watch people's like deck techs and games, and even if it's not your deck, and you just see how like other people have played against that deck. I did this a little bit in the beginning of this set. I played a bunch of hyper aggro on Pixelborn because I didn't know how to play against hyper aggro, because last set I played red purple and I was like, I don't know what to do against this stupid Daisy Duck. And so then I just played it to see what other people would do, and when they would beat me I'd be like, oh okay, learning, this is what I should do. And so that is it for this deck building video. Pretty long, I would say. Hopefully this helps you guys. I am of course still learning and still trying to make my own deck, and I feel like every time I start building a deck I just put a bunch of cards in, then I look at it, I'm like, 90 cards, gonna have to cut a lot of these cards. And so I feel like it's just lots of practice, and we will all eventually get there, and we will be able to make good decks that are good for the meta. My goal is to like one day be able to make a deck like the Atlanta champion. Remember, he played like yellow purple with Perdita and the Fairy Godmother and Chernabog. And I did hear that he made that deck because he had an enchanted Chernabog, so he wanted to use it. And that's like why he started making that deck anyways. But that would be so cool if I could make like my own original deck that breaks the meta. That would be the goal. I remember when I first started watching Lorcana videos, I followed Spessie's videos religiously because every single video was called like, this deck breaks the meta. This is the best deck. And I was like, ooh, best deck. And then I was like, oh, he just names all of his videos that. They're not actually all the best deck. But eventually I do want to be able to get to the point where I can like make a deck and it would actually work. So yeah, that is it for this video. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. And as always, keep shuffling. Hopefully you don't end up with a whole handful of non-inkables like me. All right, bye.